Hello from Basel. My name is Jill Ford and I'm Head of Communications at the BIS. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, Lord Nicholas Stern. He is I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government and Chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. He was Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the World Bank, and has held posts at other UK and overseas universities. He was second permanent secretary in the United Kingdom to Her Majesty's Treasury, head of the UK Government Economic Service, and led the Stern Review on the economics of climate change. He was knighted for services to economics in 2004, made a life peer in 2007, and appointed Companion of Honour for services to economics, international relations, and tackling climate change in 2017. It is my great honour and pleasure to introduce to you Nicholas Stern with a speech entitled Economic Leadership for Transformation in a Critical Decade, Managing Risks and Fostering Investment. I hand over to you, Lord Stern.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jill. And thank you to Louise Pereira de Silva and all at the BIS, Banque de France, IMF and NGFS for hosting this really splendid occasion. It's an honor to be amongst this audience of real leaders and indeed many of whom are economists. And a big part of what I have to say will be about the economics. The slides go in some detail, more detail than I'll speak to, but I hope the slides will be made available to everybody who wants them, so that you can study them if you wish at your leisure. Three parts of what I'm going to say. The first is the scale, the urgency, and the opportunity. This really is a decisive decade for humankind, one which requires strong decision and real leadership. The way in which that will happen is through the management of the risks. Many people will have spoken about that over the last 2 or 3 days, but where I will focus particularly my attention is how we get the investment going of the right kind to drive this change. Next slide, please. This is just to remind you, I'm not going into any detail, but we really have to reduce our emissions very fast, starting now. There's a big gap. We're well over 50 billion now. We have to bring down emissions very fast just for 2 degrees. We're way off that and much further off that for the 1.5 degrees we should be seeking. We haven't been at 3 degrees centigrade, and we're headed for over that on current actions for about 3 million years. Sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher. If we got anywhere near that, hundreds of millions, perhaps billions would have to move, with really severe consequences, including widespread conflict. The stakes we're playing for are immense. The changes we have to make are really very large, and that's what I want to focus on, the changes we have to make. Next slide, please. Now, we don't start in a very good place. We had a bad decade with slowing growth, stresses on social cohesion, a faltering of internationalism, and great pressure on emissions, climate, and biodiversity. Then the COVID crisis broke on us with all its costs of human life, stress, particularly in developing countries, around debt. So we don't start in a very good place. We have to create a recovery and a different form of growth at the same time. And in order to do that, we're going to have internationalism and work together. And we must start with internationalism around tackling the virus from the point of view of common humanity, global risk, and indeed the internationalism that we need for tackling climate change. If we don't, there could be a real lost decade for development. Next slide, please. The investment's going to have to be in all forms of capital, physical, natural, human, social. It'll be mostly private sector, so that will have to be mobilized with the right kind of incentives, but the public investment will be crucial. It can give big opportunities in terms of employment, big social and economic benefits, particularly, for example, in terms of stopping air pollution, but many more examples. So we have to get that investment going. There are therefore 2 kinds of mistakes that we can make. We can drive this recovery through a consumption boom, another roaring 20s of 100 years ago, Or another mistake we can make is to confuse fiscal responsibility with premature austerity, and that would give us another incarnation of the last decade. Fiscal responsibility means getting growth going and increasing revenues as we get growth going, but in a way that doesn't choke it off. Next slide, please. As we do this, we must recognize how fast many of the technologies that we need have already moved. For much of the power sector now, around-the-clock renewables are already cheaper in most countries of the world than fossil fuel-based systems. That covers probably a quarter of the emissions. That statement that it will be cheaper to do it clean, even without carbon prices, of course they should be there, is something that will apply to much more of the economy over time. The big systems will really matter: energy cities, energy transport cities and land use, and managing those systems will be enormously important. All of them actually work rather badly. So as we go to cut emissions, we must also manage those systems much better. We're lucky that digital and AI are moving so quickly. That will help us enormously. Next slide, please. I've been doing development economics, public policy and growth for more than half a century, and I've never seen a moment where internationalism is more important than it is now. This is a critical moment for internationalism. The quadruple wins here. If we manage demand well, then increasing demand in one country and another country together will do much better than if we do one in isolation. Setting common growth expectations, both in terms of the strength of growth and the direction of growth, will really give the confidence for investment. On the innovation side, if we move together, then discovery, learning by doing, scale, cost reduction will be much stronger. And of course, these are global public goods. So acting internationally together, including, of course, on the virus, is extremely important. This is over and above all the stories we tell, correct stories, to our undergraduates about gains from trade. Next slide, please. This is, if we get it right, the growth story of this century. It sharpens supply and boosts demand in the next few years. It gives us a Schumpeterian story of innovation, creative and growth in the medium term. That's already starting. And we know that there is no high carbon growth story. It self-destructs. So this is an enormous opportunity. It's not a story of cost. It's a story of getting the right kind of investment going. That investment has to happen if we want to realize these returns, but it is investment with very high returns. And much of what we need to do is with us. We're going to have to invest in a lot more. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. You will have focused on the risks during much of what's been said, so I'm not going to spend so much time on this. But we do, I hope, all recognize now that climate is macro critical. It's macro critical in terms of the magnitude of the physical risk. It's macro critical in terms of the transition risks. And recently, we've been seeing great pressure on transition now, not simply from the kind of public policy that we think of in economics, but also the legal systems, where a high court in Germany found against the government not moving fast enough. A high court in the Netherlands found against Shell for not moving fast enough. I teach at a university. Our young people, quite rightly, think very hard about where they want to work. So the pressure is coming from employees, customers, shareholders. The physical impacts can be of a kind I've already described, not just the disruption of a hurricane, of course, bad though that might be, but over the more medium term, mass movements of people and conflict, and of course, direct impact on labor productivity in so many places. So this is a story then of macro criticality. You've been going over that. I won't go into it in very much more detail, but it's also macro critical where I want to focus around scaling up investment. Next slide, please. There's dislocation, of course, in labor markets and stranded jobs. That does require public policy. There's dislocation in terms of changing relative prices. That requires public policy as well. So the justice of transition is not simply a question of justice. It is also a question of political economy, because if this is not handled, you will get the opposition to the changes which we so desperately need. Next slide, please. You'll have focused on the financial system, the importance of information, indeed the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, the importance of stress testing, the importance of being able to measure the kinds of moves that we need to make, new instruments and so on, and getting all financial institutions to get aligned with the Paris Agreement. Again, my friend and colleague Mark Carney and many others have stressed all this very strongly. Next slide, please. This is an appeal. Let me just spend a moment longer on this slide. This is appeal for change in the way we do economics. We're not simply now in our macro models, and indeed in our other models, dealing with basically a system that has a given structure which will not change very much. The whole point of what we're talking about is that we must change structures very strongly. And of course, some of it's coming as well as the changes due to climate change, for example, digital AI, robotics, and of course, quite a bit of post-pandemic behavior change. So we mustn't model and think as if structures are fixed, because actually we're trying to change them and they will change on us as well. The standard macro models that we use in central banks, in treasuries around the world, are really far too narrow to address the kinds of challenges we now face. They usually have exogenous growth, only modest shocks, and then they automatically return to equilibrium. Is that the world that we can be confident that we live in? In fact, we're actually looking for very strong structural change. So we have to move beyond the narrowness of those models. The same is true of the micro aspects of public policy, where I've spent much of my research career. Often this is about comparative equilibrium, where time doesn't matter. You just compare equilibrium in relation to two possible policy options. That is something we have to move beyond. Time is of the essence. And there are many market failures and indeed important absent markets. So we really have to deepen economics. And that is a profound challenge that we face. And it's a challenge to us as economists. Fortunately, we have a very rich subject: behavioral economics, institutional, system dynamics. We can bring a lot to political economy. We can bring a lot to this table, but we have to bring it in a way which we haven't done enough up to now. And here is where I would like to address a plea to our friends at the central banks. There is a remarkable collection of very powerful intellectual power and training in our central banks. I have to say, usually much better qualified in terms of economics and PhDs in economics and so on than you find in finance ministries. So at this time of having to have a very close look in real time at economics, surely the researchers at the central banks have a big role to play. As ever, we have to act and research at the same time. That means bringing several perspectives and models to the table and sound judgment. But this is a moment where we have to up our game as economists. And given there are so many good economists in central banks, that'll be a very important place for that to happen. Next slide, please. So this is the last part of what I want to have to say. How do we really accelerate the investments and innovations we need to make? Next slide, please. Well, the first is to think about the magnitude. Now, we just published a report for the G7, which I prepared at the request of Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, on May the 10th, where we tried to describe how much the extra investment should be. I can't go into the details, but ballpark, except for China, where it's a composition of investment question, but over the rest of the world, we really have to increase investment by a couple of percentage points of GDP. That would, in many countries, take us back to where we were 15 or 20 years ago. So it's really part of the story of restoring growth and productivity. Perfectly feasible. Another way of looking at it is to look at the gaps in infrastructure spending around the world, and there in terms of what's necessary to support the growth that we seek. And again, you find gaps of 2 or 3 percentage points of GDP. And if you look at what we need to do, as in the recent International Economic Agency report, or the report led by Adair Turner from the Energy Transition Commission, of what kind of investments we need to make the change, then again, you come up with similar numbers. These are arguments which mutually reinforce and overlap. They're not, as it were, additive. So that's the kind of change we have to make. But we live in a world with plenty of savings and plenty of investment opportunities. The policy challenge is to draw investment possibilities through to real investment and get the right kind of finance, right place, right time. Next slide, please. So how do we draw through investment in this world which has the potential and the potential available savings? You need a very clear, strong sense of direction. There are many absent markets here, absent markets for new technologies, long-run markets for carbon prices. What will matter for getting investment going will expectations around a clear sense of direction. Secondly, the investment climate, that means the regulatory structures, the ability to get things done, getting governments that support and don't get in the way, and of course the right kind of policies, which I'll turn to in just a moment. And we need the capacity to build the pipelines and execute the projects. So that's going to be collaboration, central banks, local governments, private sector, and the local and multilateral development banks, also very important. Next slide, please. Now, this is for particularly my microeconomic friends. What kinds of policies to draw through the right kind of investment are we talking about here? Well, I usually focus on 6 big market failures. Number one, and deliberately number one, of course, is the negative externality from greenhouse gases, where we do need a carbon price, and a strong carbon price in some shape or form. Joe Stiglitz and I and others have argued that by 2030, that carbon price should probably be ballpark $100 per ton of CO2, rising strongly towards that starting now. But that's not the only market failure, and indeed these other 5 market failures are critical. R&D, we know about the market failure associated with the publicness of ideas, the imperfections in risk and capital markets when investment is so important. Lots we can do there in terms of organizing our finance in the right way to reduce share and manage risks. So much of this is about networks in electricity grids, public transport, broadband, recycling, structure of cities, and so on, where public action and regulation is critical to get, and design is critical to getting these networks going. Information will be extremely important, both for consumers and for producers. The last one, co-benefits, is rather a flat word, but this is immense. This is air pollution. This is our ecosystems and our biodiversity. We probably kill something close to 10 million people a year in the world through air pollution, some inside, some outside, in a number of deaths in the world each year, which is something around 50 million or more. That is a huge phenomenon, and a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it associated with burning fossil fuels. So we have these 6 big market failures. Number one, carbon pricing, very important, but not only carbon pricing, and many of these will require regulation, design, networking, other policies to make them happen. In making policy, we must be predictably flexible. That's absolutely crucial, because we're going to learn a lot along the way, which will require us to adjust policies. But we must do it in a way that people can predict, that they understand. If you're supporting, say, solar, then we will say that as the cost of solar comes down and as it is disseminated, diffused more in the economy, then we will adjust the support. But it must be predictably flexible. Central bank governors and monetary policy committees know all about predictable flexibility in monetary policy. We need it in micro as well. Next slide, please. Innovation. There's so much that we can do to draw through the technologies we already know about, and there are a lot of obstacles. I mean, for example, offshore wind is now extremely competitive with other forms of generating electricity, but we need well-functioning grid structures and storage and transmission to allow that to rise. Similarly, for solar and other things. So there are a lot of obstacles to the existing technologies which we have to think about. We can use digital and AI to manage the systems much better. Some sectors are harder to bait than others. Steel, cement, plastic, air, sea transport. We do need to invest in research and innovation there. As we saw in vaccines, advanced market commitments can be important for that. And a lot of that research will be universities, research institutions, private sector working together. In drawing through innovation, regulation, standards and design, very important. Think about the story of LED light bulbs coming in very quickly when we decided to regulate out the incandescent light bulbs. And of course, a lot of this will come from consumer behavior as well, and public discussion there and information can make a big difference. So we do need strong carbon pricing to draw through the innovation, but these other things are going to be very important as well. Next slide, please. Finance is critical, reducing, sharing, managing risk. I'm not going to repeat what Mark Carney has had to say on, and many others have had to say on shifting the whole private sector. We've been discussing that over the last 2 or 3 days. But what's very important here, what I do want to emphasize, is raising the level of international public finance to release decision-making in COP26 in November this year in Glasgow, and the importance of the MDBs in helping with policies to reduce and manage risk, and helping with taking the kinds of risk that the private sector find particularly difficult. For example, the early stage difficulties that you often hit in infrastructure implementation. Next slide, please. So I've emphasized the role of the MDBs. I think it's very important to challenge also the MDBs to step up, work better as a group, work even better on the policy and capacities, and use their balance sheets much more strongly. But as we press them to scale up, we've got to recognize that that will mean that they hit capital constraints earlier, because it's not just scaling up now, it's staying up and growing over this coming decade. So they will need the capital support. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide. This is the yes, we can slide. I've described the challenges of managing risk and of promoting investment at this absolutely critical period for change in world history. But we do have no shortage of global saving. We have remarkable technical change, even on the back of rather modest policy. It can be much faster on the back of better policy. We do have the Paris agreements and others which are actually starting to be enforced in the courts, as I've noted. And we do have, and I say this as someone who teaches at a university and meets the young people, we have the wonderful pressure and forward look and the well-informed young people of the world. So we really can make the changes, foster the investment and innovation that I've tried to describe. The question now is to research and understand and act to do it better, and generate the political will and the capability to proceed. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Lord Stern, for taking us through that journey of, I suppose, the options and the issues facing us at this, I suppose, macro critical moment. We have a question that we've been asking, I suppose, all of our invited speakers, and I'm afraid that you've had so many solutions. But if you have to suggest just one thing to coordinate the fight against climate change, what would that be?
Well, the first thing to say, this isn't a problem with just one thing. You're trying to change the structure of production to try to foster investment right across the world. So I'm going to take 3 things, Jill. The first is the price of carbon. You've got to get the incentives right. There are a number of policies I emphasized, regulation as well, but let me emphasize on the policy incentive side, the price of carbon. On the confidence side, because investment is about confidence, about expectations, clear plans and credible commitment from governments around the world, and a collaborative commitment from governments around the world. And the third thing is you've got to enable that investment, and that means strong finance. And I think there's a special role at this moment in history for the multilateral development banks, as there was when they were created in the crucial period after the Second World War, where we understood that we need internationalism, investment, and particularly in infrastructure. This is such a moment.
Great, thank you very much. And maybe I could ask one question before we leave. I suppose we talked about the multilateral banks there, but maybe just in terms of the finance ministries and central banks, how do you think the finance ministries and central banks could work together on this?
Well, I should say I have been inside one particular finance ministry as a civil servant for 3 years, and a very good one, the UK finance ministry, and I've been very close, of course, to friends in central banks, including through the Banque de France and the NGFS, where I still, with Sylvie Gouillard and others working closely now. So I do think that this is a moment where central banks and ministries of finance have to work together. Now, all moments, if you like, are moments where central banks and finance ministries have to work together. But this is one of particular importance because the big public policy decision makers are trying to foster change. It's not simply just maintain stability. They're trying to maintain stability and foster change. The biggest responsibility lies with the ministries of finance, economics, where that public policy is set. And what we must avoid is shoving it all onto central banks. I think the past 15 or 20 years has been quite a lot of shoving of responsibility onto central banks. So ministries of finance must step up and take that responsibility. But at the same time, the central bank should be arm in arm.
Thank you very much, Lord Stern. We really appreciated your intervention, your time today, and we will make your slides available after the conference. So we're very grateful. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward closely to following your next advances. So I suppose we've had a lot of rich conversations so far on various crucial climate topics, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. The discussions aren't quite over yet as we move next to our final panel of the day. So our final panel brings together the General Manager of the BIS, the Presidents and governors of the People's Bank of China, the French Central Bank and the ECB to assess how to manage expectations, balance actions and communication and coordinate with other actors. The session will start shortly, and you can join the session live in about 3 minutes on YouTube or on the event platform with the host and moderator, Gillian Tett of the FT. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Take care.